good break.
Because it's over.
Well, all right. Everybody's refreshed.
Let's go.
We're missing David.
And we are just missing Howard. And,
Howard.
oh, there's Emily. He's right here.
Okay, we will, so that we're not here forever, go ahead and get started. Next item is future land uses identified in the comprehensive plan. Eileen, is that you?
Yes, that's me.
Okay.
And we're going to talk a little bit more beyond the comprehensive plan as well, but seeing all those slides reminded me of something that happened back when my youngest daughter, who's now 32, almost 33, was 5. And I brought her to take your daughter to work day, and I showed her the plans for the Marriott, which we had reviewed, and I said, now this is built, and it's a 10-story hotel, and blah, blah. I explained it all. I said, what I do is I review the plans, and went through it all. And the next time she was in the car with me with a little friend that we were taking home, we're on the ramp to the Beltline, and I hear her lean over in the back seat and say to her friend, "That's the building that my mom built." She got part of it, Anyway.
And Abby's going through the same thing now,
Yeah.
right?
Anyway, so one of the things that I wanted to talk about and start with on the land use issue and the things that we've done and are facing the city in the future, or that we get to embrace. One of the things that I think shows in especially a presentation like Jeff's is the balance that we have in the city between residential and non-residential. We do have a fairly large percentage of non-residential tax base, which of course those TIFs are in part responsible for. We have a very good balance between single-family and multifamily, and not every community does. And then a balance between development and open space. For years, we've said we have about a 25 or 26% permanent public open space in the city. It's gone down just a little bit, and I haven't really delved into why, but we expect that we would maintain that. And again, that's a fairly high percentage for a community of our size. And Jeff touched on this as well. The city's been very proactive in saying, and this goes back 50 years and continues through today, where do we want the development and what type of development do we want? The business park development by the city in the 70s and the 80s, I would argue, was really a precursor to our job base today. It showed that the city valued development. We got some excellent early companies, Agricitas and Rayovac had a warehouse there. And I think that helped set the stage for the jobs that we have today. Way back in the 60s or 70s, the council decided that they would start buying conservancy land. And I'm sure that wasn't an easy decision either. Budgets are always tight. But they made sure that when land became available, or as they had the chance, they would work with the property owner and were able to amass a large area of conservancy. As Jeff also said, use of the TIF to facilitate job growth, density and intensity of development, and then improve water quality. Our existing land use percentages, broken down in many different, some of these categories don't apply to us, but they're just standard, just shows the various uses. We don't have a ton of agricultural land, but it's also shown as vacant.
I had no idea.
This future land use map has not been reviewed yet by the Planning Commission, other than just now this morning. It was created in a contract that we had with Van de Waal, and we will be looking at it with the Planning Commission and then eventually back to the council. But we have some constraints on here, and we also have a lot of opportunities with the future land use. Here's a city view showing a little bit more detail of some of the area. Doesn't have the whole city.
Howard, you have a question?
Eileen,
Yes,
go back
Hear me?
one slide.
okay.
Big green blob to the north of the city, which is your future, which town of Springfield. Town of Springfield is exclusive Ag A1, right?
Right.
How would you plan on working that problem out?
And we are going to
Right.
talk about that. That's one of the reasons why infill and redevelopment is so important to the city. because we do have constraints. That land that's shown in the green, the town of Springfield land, is some of the best farmland in the country. And
Not the
they are
state, the country.
Yeah, not the state, yeah, no, I think I said the country, yeah.
Yeah, you did.
And it
I
could be
just
the
wanna
world. I
reinforce
actually
it.
heard, yeah, you're right, I actually heard somebody say the world, but I know it's the country.
It's close to the Crimea.
Yeah, it's very good farmland. And the city worked very extensively with the town of Springfield to come up with our intergovernmental agreement map back in 2003. And so that is a constraint that we have. I'm going to show you, though, that we do have land available for development. And again, we also, through our future urban development area planning, we also have identified areas for redevelopment. And I think the Plan Commission and the council will continue to do that, because redevelopment and infill, even though they are as tough as Jeff was saying, and we all know how tough they are, it's a compact urban form, it makes use of existing infrastructure and transportation choices. It makes a lot of sense. But we also do have some land for development going forward, 20, 30, 40 years, greenfield. But I think that's part of the balance. We have had a combination of some greenfield development, but also probably, I think, and I don't have the statistic right in front of me, but I think we're the second highest community in Dane County, at least we were 5 years ago maybe, for redevelopment and infill projects. So that's important. One of the things that we do, and we will talk with the Plan Commission about, and then the council, is what's the demand, what's the current supply, what's the demand for housing and for redevelopment and for commercial development and job development. If we look at the Department of Administration population projections for the city, and they were a little bit behind, for instance, their 2018 estimate was already greater by about 900 people than their original 5-year forecast a few years ago for 2020. I adjusted those. I looked back at historically what we've had. We've had some jumps where there was a lot of construction of multifamily. We've gone up to as much as like 25% in a 10-year period, maybe a little higher in the very early years of the city, maybe even before it was a city. But historically, I've always said, we have about 1 to 1.5% a year population growth. The DOA figures adjusted show it's about 1.26%, average every year in a 5-year period, about 6.3, I think it is, for every 5-year period. Looking at that and projecting out to 2040, we have, right now in the city, we have just over 10,000 housing units. With that projection of about 1.26% a year, we would need about 3,200 housing units until 2040. Well, if we just look at what we have approved already, but not yet platted, but approved in the community of Bishops Bay, that's probably another 2,000, of which a big chunk of that is multifamily. And hopefully half of that multifamily will be condominium development, ownership, but multifamily. So then if we look at where we can have the other 1,200, and this is just not even assuming any more infill or redevelopment, which again, we strongly, I think, as a city, encourage and support infill and redevelopment for the reasons I mentioned, and probably lots of other reasons too, that I'm not even thinking of right now. If we looked at a very low estimate, say 4 units an acre gross, knowing that we, have to look at infrastructure and stormwater and open space, that open space percentage we want to try and maintain. Just for instance, I think Middleton Hills gross is like 3 units per acre. Net is 4.5, I think. I could be wrong about that. I haven't double checked it in
And
years.
that's including all the common green space area in Middleton Hills.
That would be right. That would be 3. And like Fox Ridge is less than 2, I think. But if we just said 4 units an acre, we need about 300 acres to to satisfy the demand that's outside of the Bishops Bay. And by the way, when the city completed the future urban development area study, which now I'm going to call FUDA, if that's okay, What the assumption that was made and agreed to by the committee and then the city was we would project or assume that 70% of our residential growth would be provided for in the community of Bishops Bay for like the next 20 years. Now, it might be slower than that, so maybe these other areas will pick up. I'll show you the map in just a minute for the Town of Springfield intergovernmental agreement map, but it's also shown in the hatched area north of the Conservancy. We have about over 600 acres left that hasn't been annexed, that's in our developable area, or the first phase of the developable area. We go a little bit further than that to Dorn Creek. So to 2040 might consume half of that conceivably if we don't develop at a higher density and also have more infill projects that would be taking up some of that demand. There's the agricultural preservation that Howard mentioned. And again, I think the city feels pretty strongly about that, or has historically. I remember when Epic did come and talk with us when they were looking, and basically I think the mayor at the time and administrator and staff said, well, you know, this is an area that we're not developing into, and of course they would have needed far more than we could have ever had in terms of a growth area, so it worked out well for the whole region for them.
So, Lynn, that designation is by the state or by the city, or who?
Agricultural preservation?
Yes.
It's in an intergovernmental agreement between the city of Middleton and the town of Springfield.
And it could be changed, right?
It could be, if both parties agreed to it, and the life of the agreement is only until 2029 at this point. We had a 20-year agreement, and we extended it 5 years. So,
Thank you.
and the planned, I should just point out, the planned neighborhood community of Bishops Bay, that project showed 2,450 housing units in the city of Middleton, of which about 2/3 were multifamily. Again, the multifamily, hopefully half and half rental and owner occupied, and then about 400 in the town of Westport. And the planned residential growth area, that's essentially the area that's shown as growth area in our intergovernmental agreement with the town of Springfield. One of the things the Planning Commission and the council did years ago, though, when they were looking at interceptors and the Airport Road interceptor in connection with the Pheasant Branch interceptor, sewer interceptor, was, I remember one of our Planning Commission members said, again, probably 20 years ago, we don't want to create capacity in a sewer interceptor that could serve the area northwest of the airport. We want to send a message 50 years into the future that should be farmland. And that's what the Public Works Committee did, that's what the Planning Commission did, and that's what the council did. So there's been decisions through the years that have said, we're not going northwest because of those, prime agricultural lands.
And is that also because it's a wetland?
There is an area just north of the airport. You can't really see it on here, but that has some environmentally sensitive land, I believe. And we have identified that and I'll show you in a minute the map, as environmental corridor.
Okay.
So, but I think a lot of the rest of it is prime farmland. We're also showing neighborhood mixed use. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Speculating. I've owned my farm for been in the family for 100 years. I've always planned on selling it to finance my retirement.
Sure. There are
What
cases like that.
incentives have you got? Are there any incentives to cover that kind of scenario for development?
That's a really good question. We don't really have any other than disincentive, not having annexation, or not annexing that property, not giving development entitlements. We don't really have any financial incentives to keep somebody doing that. We did have a case at the Plan Commission last week, and will be at the council this week, where a farmer that's shown in our growth area wants to keep farming, and they need different type of ag zoning for farmland preservation credits. That's a small way that the city can participate in our extraterritorial area by supporting that. Does that answer your question, David? Sorry, I'm not sure if I...
there are state, federal, and county
Oh, yeah.
programs, purchase of agricultural conservation easements, where you can donate or have an easement purchased to maintain it.
That's good.
But there already are tax incentives, because it's use value assessment for ag land, and if it's exclusively zoned, you get the agricultural tax credit, so. The development value wouldn't be that high if it's in the county zoning for ag anyway. But, yeah.
But I think there have been cases like that where someone expects, in the case of the farmland that's around us, for the most part, in talking with the farmers or knowing what the towns are saying about it, they are very intent on keeping those farms as farmland. But I think that scenario can happen in communities. So,
Places have tried transfer development, right?
sure. It's true, and Springfield did look at that. I'm not sure of the status of their program, but they did look at that within their town, so that is an important component. The orange areas on here are showing some potential infill or redevelopment areas. The Middleton Springs area, potentially. I mean, there's a couple areas that are somewhat underutilized. And then the University Avenue corridor. And then Jeff showed some of these, and I'll be showing a couple more. We've had some redevelopment and some infill along the Parmenter corridor and Parmenter west to the Beltline, and then also within Greenway, especially within Greenway, the residential infill. And then I mentioned that the future urban development area study, the city worked with Capital Area Regional Planning Commission and also partners of Wanakee, Westport, and Springfield. There was a committee of 2 people, either Plan Commission or elected officials from each community, and then Abby and I were staff from the city, town. The towns had their consultants as staff, and then Wanakee had staff, and worked very diligently to create scenarios for different types of development. And then there was a lot of public outreach several years ago to have people vote on what they wanted. What actually got selected was a compact form of development. It was a compilation of existing plans and really showed an emphasis and a recommendation for redevelopment within the city of Middleton and also Wanakee to help fulfill some of that need, and then shows our growth area as further fulfilling that. And it also, I don't know that we have it on the website, but we definitely should have it. As part of that process, there was an incredible environmental resources condition report that was put together. Lots of good information. We took some of that and had maps created that are going to be part of our comp plan update, showing, the natural resources of the area, soils, that type of thing. So that was a very good planning exercise. Let people see, if you had this type of density, this is what it looks like, and this is the land that's used. And it was a very visual process. This is showing the area that was on the previous land use map, showing potential redevelopment. And certainly we've already had a lot of that happen. But also, as Jeff said, and we will say on a regular basis, redevelopment or infill is hard. It's a change. There's neighborhoods. I think somebody asked, I think maybe Alder Sullivan asked a very good question about neighbors. And I really think our process does work well, even if, I think the most important thing is for people to be heard and also then have that addressed. And again, I think we have good examples of that. Again, this is showing the area that was on the earlier map, the area from Parmenter west to the Beltline, lots of redevelopment and infill happening. And then the Parmenter corridor. When we look at the demand for commercial land or office land, it's a little tougher to predict, but in TID 3 and TID 5 both, there's a little over 50 acres of land that's available, or either for, it's currently greenfields, or it would be redevelopment, and that encompasses or has the potential to provide for hundreds of thousands of square feet of office use or mixed use or research. but it also has the potential for several $100 million worth of development as well. One of our challenges, and we're going to talk about that, is going forward, you know, we have a residential growth area for Bishop's Bay and for the town of Springfield area that we've agreed to with them. But those areas don't necessarily lend themselves to job creation. Community Bishop's Bay will have a town center, and they will have some office use. They have, I forget how many square feet, but they have, you know, some of that. But it isn't a big job park. So one of the challenges going forward, once we've used up the land that we have within the city, will be where are the other redevelopment opportunities or infill. Like I said, Greenway Station's done some of that by putting some buildings in parking lots. Maybe we do away with some of the parking lots if we don't need those, or maybe there's another alternative. So anyway, that's something that we'll be looking at in the comp plan and need to be aware of. The University Avenue build plan was done in 2009 through an extensive public process. It wasn't adopted, and we're hoping to have at least a summary and the design guidelines and some parameters from that the Plan Commission and the Council will look at as part of the comp plan update. These are- no, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say that we've seen a lot of failures on University Avenue. You know, the
Oh.
Sonic and now the
Mhm.
Chicken Run
Mhm.
and the old Micacino.
Yeah,
So they're vacant.
Right.
And so maybe revisiting how 2009 looked
sure.
compared to what the experience has been now in 2019.
That's a very good point, and I think also, one of the things we realized in the University Avenue process was just the constraints that exist. None of those lots are very deep, and so there's land assemblage or, you know, ownership assemblage. So I think that is a very good point, to think about what uses do make the most sense there. The FUDA plan talks about mixed use with residential, and maybe no more than 4 stories, again, because of a parking constraint. There's also, though, the issue of if we want to look at University Avenue as a transit corridor, especially if we do some type of, rapid transit or something, then we might even want to increase density if we have parking taken care of. So there's going to be a lot of issues going forward, I think, with that.
I just want to say too, but I tried to access both of those restaurants, and it's really hard, especially in traffic.
Oh, yeah.
And I know you guys know that, but being on that far end of University, that is a struggle. You know, especially because I have the kids in the car and they're screaming and they want food now, and I'm like trying to make a left turn and you can't.
Yeah, there's a
So-
continuous stream up, yeah.
Right, and so if density makes sense there, where people can then just walk to restaurants or walk to stores, I'm open to that.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that our successful businesses are in higher density mixed-use areas, and the auto-oriented strip commercial
Right.
development is what's failing.
Exactly.
And
And
this
that's
is,
across the country.
yeah, that's a good point. This is just an example of the type of detail that's in the build plan, some of the public improvements that could, or enhancements that could take place, or potential areas of infill or redevelopment. And this is our intergovernmental agreement map with the town of Springfield. Area A that's noticed there is the first area for redevelopment. One property has developed in that, and that's the Misty Valley development. And so we do still have about 600 acres or so there. The next tier is up to Dorn Creek, and of course, there would have to be quite a buffer with that. I mean, all of this assumes that, you know, every environmentally sensitive area is set aside as part of the plat and protected. That's why, you know, I did such a conservative number for the units per acre. But, you know, we do feel pretty proud about this map, given that it was a negotiation with the elected officials, city, and of the town. And it did involve several public hearings and public input sessions with the property owners, because there was some concern that farmers might think, well, wait a minute, either are you trying to develop my land, or are you trying to not let me develop my land? And I would say that for the most part, from what I remember, people were pretty well satisfied that we, you know, made the right choices. Area B is shown there as environmental corridor. The golds area or the yellow area in the town are areas where they've agreed that they would have either adding to existing rural subdivisions or creating rural subdivisions. But they primarily are interested in exclusive ag, and I think the city of Middleton has gone on record repeatedly to support that.
Lynn, how about the area east of the Misty Valley, which is north of Milton Hills? What happens there, right across from it?
Yeah, that's a growth area. You know, if the,
That's in the city, or what, that's in
it's not
the
in the city, no, it's in the town right now.
town of Westport,
It's the town of Springfield.
Springfield?
It's east of Misty Valley is town of Springfield.
But that's not marked as our growth area then?
No,
Oh,
it is. Because Misty Valley is, do you see the high road designation?
Yeah.
Misty Valley is just to the left of that. And
how
so the
about
other side of High Road that's our growth area. The whole yellow area is growth area.
No, but how about the,
Right here. That's what you're talking about.
You said to the east, right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
directly north of Middleton.
yeah, on your map, if you
There's
would look at it, it's to the right of it.
It's still in the city boundary.
That's the city
Sorry.
boundary?
The red is the city boundary.
Are you, yeah, that's the city. So are you talking about this area that I'm pointing to?
Yes.
No,
What
no.
area?
Go to your,
Because here's Misty Valley.
yeah, go
Thank
to
you.
east.
East of the green area,
East of the green area, that's city, and then a little bit further,
a little bit further to the east.
yeah, that one there. Yeah,
Oh, this?
little bit above, little bit north of. What happens there? Who owns that?
The man's land?
Oh, yeah.
No,
that's not the
Laufenburg
part
is
that's being-
close to the. That's close to the North Lake. It's not anywhere close.
That's the
to
town of Westport, yeah, that's the town of Westport. But
That's town of Westport.
So where it says Area A, the A is an acre farm that the county is interested in.
I'm sorry, I accidentally did that.
No.
I know, I accidentally did it. Sorry.
See,
Mark,
The mic.
the county is interested in area close to the Pheasant Branch Road.
Yeah,
and
well,
this
that's
is-
area
This is the
A.
high road. This is close to the high road. This is not the county stuff.
So where you see Area A, the letter, I mean, the A, the letter itself is in the middle of the acre farm that the county has an interest in.
This is Acre Farm.
We'll look at-
And then east of that, where the arrow is pointing, or was just now, was pointing, that's the Laufenburg farm that Eileen mentioned earlier in terms of the, what's before the council on Tuesday for the farmland tax credits, the rezoning.
Go to the next map, which is the Westport future land use map, and shows the area. Let's see. Here's the Laufenburg up there, sorry. Yeah, you know what, that is what's, right, it would be changed as rural preservation, yeah. But again, we have the community of Bishop's Bay, and not that, and that farmer might decide, it's a century farm, it's been in their farm, or in their family for 125 years, and they would like to continue farming it. At some point, they might not want to, and then they would come in and we would, you know, the city would look at that. But with the town of Westport, you know, we have planned cooperatively since the late 90s, and trying to get ahead of a large property owner that was there and determining, you know, exactly what the city and the town wanted to see. So right now, 20 years, 25 years, we're not showing large areas outside of the community of Bishop's Bay in the town, but there are some areas, Laufenburg and a little bit further north of that, potentially. And then, as I said, the community Bishop's Bay plan projected in the FUTA process to absorb about 70% of our growth over the next 20 years. Some of the challenges, and I'm just going to wrap it up so we can hear about the community campus planning, but the issues and challenges, that continued balance. we have benefited greatly from the job development that's happened, the job creation over the last 40 years. And TID has helped with that tremendously. And we've had land that's been set aside. Going forward, we either need to have additional infill, densification, intensification of those uses. I think that'll be part of the strategy. And also looking, as we grow north residentially, how can we incorporate business parks within neighborhoods or areas for growth of jobs. Our growth areas are somewhat limited, in part because we're next to the city of Madison, and we have an agreement with the city of Madison, long-term intergovernmental agreement, that shows Blackhawk Road as the dividing line. They won't go north of Blackhawk Road, and we won't go south of it. We also have existing development in the town of Middleton, and we have service limitations in the town of Middleton and also resource areas in the town. It's the Black Earth Creek watershed, and we also have some sewer and water service limitations. We do have some opportunity, and I think Jeff showed it on his map, just so I didn't put it here, for the quarry, if that's annexed for potential business park. That's about 66 acres of land that's not developed yet. The pro-build site. So there are some areas in that area for growth, particularly of business development. But we also have with the town of Springfield the ag preservation, and that's why we've tried to maximize and show a little greater density in the growth area that we do have. Then another issue, another challenge is density, densification. When you're adding something to a neighborhood, you know, how can you integrate that into the design of the neighborhood? Make sure that you have taken into account people's concerns, but also recognizing that, especially on a corridor like University Avenue or Parmenter or Allen Boulevard, there's going to be changes. You know, there probably needs to be densification and intensification of uses. So I think infill and redevelopment is always a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. Transportation issues are huge in the city of Middleton. Traffic issues that we have, because we don't just have to deal with our own traffic from our own projects. We have to deal with traffic from the north and the west and south, with major highways 14 and then county trunks and 12. So that will be, we want to make sure we have mobility to jobs. We want to make sure we have multimodal opportunities, transit, bike paths, trails, pedestrian emphasis. So that will be important in the comp plan and beyond going forward. Stormwater management and quality and quantity after this last year, it's never been more important. It's always been important, I think, to the city of Middleton. Witness the Water Resources Management Commission, which is just second to none in terms of expertise on the committee and value that they provide. But I think that will be an issue, again, because things like, it's fairly easy to plan stormwater in a green field, but when you have redevelopment or infill, then you do have issues of stormwater and both quality and quantity, and it gets maybe messy and expensive, but it has to be dealt with. And that's where TIF has greatly helped us as well. And then another issue is housing affordability, because I think, you know, we all are concerned about that, making sure people can live here if they want to. If they want to live and work in the same community, great, but giving choices.
Thank you.
There's not any more questions, so you can turn it over to Abby.
Great job.
Can I have one?
You were right.
David?
Areas,
I'm sorry.
areas east of the city again, Franklin Avenue, North Avenue, Maybury, is it Mayfield? Maybury. Maywood. We've started to see some upgrading of existing houses, and sort of picking up on your infill development, redevelopment, keeping costs down. I wonder if the city's thought at all about trying to make some incentives to get those areas to redevelop quicker. You know, because there's a single person houses in there. that are now becoming family houses. And that absorbs a lot of people. But it's a very slow, expensive process. And I just wonder whether the city can't think of some way of incentivizing that kind of redevelopment.
Sure. I think there are other communities that have done that, and I think that's something that maybe the Workforce Housing Task Force could look at. I don't know. Kurt knows probably more than I do about that. I know I came from a community many years ago, like 30-some years ago, that had a rental rehab program. And we certainly have in the downtown provided a facade renovation for existing and older commercial buildings. So maybe there is something like that for owner-occupied. We talked about trying to have a program like the City of Madison had for TIF assistance for single family, but I think we felt like there maybe wasn't enough opportunity in our existing TIFs for that, and it would be, but it's certainly something to talk about. I think it's a good point going forward. Good question.
Any other questions from the Plan Commission or Eileen? That was a good point, David.
Should I steal my water? Been around the block a time.
Been around the block. And so my question is about, a little about the TID, about what we were describing or going through this morning and the changes over time. And I guess I'm curious to hear your perspective on how much the sort of city tax roll has kept up with the development over time and how that's changed over your career in terms of, maybe the residential portion not carrying the whole load. In our case, the businesses, were a huge success. Mm-hmm. So, we're definitely in a changing time and there's different ways people work now. I'm curious moving forward if you have any perspective on how tax and land development in and of itself, from a land use perspective and where the city's positioned, some of the things you've learned over your career and how that we might want to consider some things in the future.
That's a really good and complicated question. I think that's one of the things that we need to do as a city, and I think hopefully have been, is being aware of the changes that are affecting the workforce and mobility and work at home and those types of things, and try to be accommodating of those. And I think also we've been very fortunate. We don't have, we have many large employers and tax base, but it's not concentrated in one industry or one area. So I think that will help as we change. I mean, I couldn't predict 20 years ago, I couldn't predict, these things, for instance. So who knows what's ahead? But I think if we, as a Plan Commission and council and staff, try to stay on top of that and be flexible. And I also think what protects us is good quality development. If you have that, there'll be a use and something that takes its place if it's not. And I don't know if that answered your question at all, but we should write your question down so we can work on that as part of the comp plan.
Joanna?
Just kind of piggybacking off of what Jennifer was mentioning, but there are some facts that we do know, right? We know that certain environmental resources are finite, at least as far as we know. So looking at sustainability and looking through that lens allows us to do some of those plans that think about the future, how we want to make it, knowing that we have the data today tells us something about the future.
That's a very good point about the sustainability. I guess when I was thinking good quality development, that's kind of what I was thinking of, that you incorporate the best practices at the time and then hope that that's a very good point about sustainability. And I didn't mention sustainability, but I feel like it permeates everything we do and should be first and foremost in the comp plan and our actions, so that's a good point.
If there are no more questions, then Abby on community campus planning.
So now we're gonna zoom way in to our city-owned
properties in downtown Middleton. Jeff talked a little bit about the phases of downtown redevelopment in the city, and I view this as an opportunity for a future phase of downtown redevelopment, with the city being the largest property owner in the downtown. So why are we talking about the community campus plan now, when we know we're not building buildings in the next couple of years, we're not reusing space at this time? The reason that we would like to take a look at this and prepare a plan now is because there's deferred maintenance certainly happening on city buildings, both at City Hall and at the library. And a large reason for that is we don't really know what the future of the buildings are, so we don't know if it makes sense to invest in an overhaul of the mechanicals if the building's not going to be here long term. We have projects that have arisen, for example, the solar projects, where we said, well, we don't know if City Hall's going to remain in its current form. We don't know what's going to happen with the library. We know that the library did a space needs analysis, and they determined that they're short of space, which I don't think is a surprise to anyone. But there are these questions that are continually coming up now as we do capital budgeting, and whether or not to take a step forward and request a budget allocation for a particular item when we don't know the future of the buildings. So in 2019, the City Council budgeted $120,000 in TIF 3 funding to develop a community campus plan. And I included a draft request for proposals in your packet. And I just want to go over some of the highlights of what our staff has put together for that. So this slide shows the community campus area as we've defined it, and it includes all of the city and CDA owned properties in the downtown. One of the things that jumps out at me when you look at this is that cardinal land use sin that Kurt Paulson mentioned, which is most of the property is being utilized for service parking currently. We did include initially in the initial draft of how we outlined the community campus area, we didn't have the tourism depot, but we did include that. It's a relatively small component of the overall community campus from a square footage standpoint, but obviously that building is a national designated historic landmark. We wouldn't foresee any changes to the building, but I know tourism is interested in being involved in the process as well, as looking at what their space needs are and what the future of their building looks like. So we have identified 6 primary goals for the community campus planning process. The RFP also outlines several additional goals. We would really like for this to be a very public process, so we would foresee some of those additional goals changing depending on what we hear from residents in our community. But these are the kind of finite primary goals that aren't likely to change. We would like to identify opportunities to modernize and or replace the city's current facilities in downtown Middleton. We want to identify opportunities for more efficient utilization of land through combined flexible spaces that can serve more than one purpose. And we also want to take a look at underground or shared parking opportunities. We need to ensure that our municipal facilities space needs are met and can accommodate future growth of the city. We would like to identify opportunities for private development or public-private partnerships and encourage mixed-use development. And this 4th goal here is the reason that we're using TIF 3 funding for the project, because we do think that there may be some opportunities for private development within what currently is the community campus area. We would like to enhance downtown Middleton by creating concepts for buildings that can be visually appealing, inviting, customer-friendly, and functional. And also prevalent throughout all of the city's planning, we want to align with the city's goals for environmental sustainability. So the scope of work includes 2 phases. The first phase would be to identify the space needs for public facilities, in particular City Hall and the Senior Center. The library already has an up-to-date space needs study, which was prepared by Dimension 4 architects. So much of that work has already been done. And then we also would like to evaluate community center space needs. So this could be for recreation programming, possibly the youth center could be involved. We kind of want to determine what square footage would be involved with something like that, and whether there's interest from the community in pursuing that. Before we would allow the consultant to move forward to phase 2 of the process, we would want the city council to adopt the findings of phase 1 and agree with the space needs determinations that have been made. Phase 2 would involve public input, programming, concept designs, and also cost estimates. So this is where we would be having a consultant present space needs to the public, obtain public input to develop goals, prepare programming and concept design alternatives with cost estimates, and we would be looking at a minimum of 3. Hold 2 public forums to obtain input, and then the council would select the concept design alternative. And throughout all of this, we included in the RFP that we would like to ensure that all of the data that is provided throughout this planning process would remain relevant for a minimum of 10 years. Here we've outlined selection criteria. We could certainly break this down further. This is kind of following along the same lines for what we did with the Plaza RFP evaluation process, and we had our Plaza advisory team actually do the rankings in the matrix and then bring a recommendation forward to the Plan Commission and Council. And here's the project schedule that we've outlined. Assuming favorable input from you all, we would bring the RFP to the Plan Commission and Council for approval. We could issue the RFP as early as February 20th, and then we would like to select a firm by the end of June. So that would give us the second half of the year for the consultant to actually prepare the entire study. And this may be ambitious from a timing standpoint, so there is a possibility that this could also bleed over into 2020. For the Community Campus Committee, we're proposing a 7-member committee, same size as the Downtown Plaza Advisory Team, and that group has worked very well together. We would like to have an appointment from the Common Council and the Plan Commission, as well as Parks, Rec, and Forestry because of their involvement with any potential community center space that may be included. We would like to have the library director and the senior center director serve on the committee because they are the most familiar with the building, their building needs. We would like to get a representative from the Chamber of Commerce, and then also the Downtown Resident Neighborhood Association should be involved as well. So that's all I have for you.
Question. I have the 6 goals listed, but under additional goals, it doesn't really address anything about the sensitive historic nature of some of the buildings and residents until much, and I don't even think it mentioned the historic nature of it and how to be sensitive to the National Registries, and these are the oldest buildings, and I'd like to see that incorporated in the goals.
That is a very good point. Yeah, definitely. We want to protect the city's landmarks and make sure that any new development is
Minimal impact to the current
to the
residents.
historic. Yep.
But we didn't include Rowley House in the community.
No, you did
No.
not.
No, but that
The
could be,
biggest actual landmark would be the tourism depot.
that is in it, but it's, surrounds it, and it, if you put up this on the National Registry, you don't want a 5-story building right next to it, or,
Right. Well, like the Opera House,
yeah, right.
the Opera House building is directly adjacent to the senior center building.
Right.
Example. Yep.
And I think this is a great selection of people that should be involved. I just want to make sure that just because it's in this neighborhood doesn't mean that other neighborhoods aren't interested. In fact, the whole city is interested. So when the Plan Commission and the council thinks about who should be on that group, that it not just be the people that live here, it's also because it's the community-wide and should have a focus for how people access it and get to this location.
Yep, that's a very good point. Initially, we were proposing that rather than a Chamber of Commerce representative, that it be a downtown business representative. And Sean Stowski, our Public Works Director, encouraged us to take a more broad view of things because it's the entire city that uses the community campus, and so we shouldn't be limiting in that regard. I liked the idea of keeping the residents to the local residents just because, you know, communicating changes to the neighborhood and that sort of thing, I think will be really important to have that.
Yeah, I agree with Joanna, and I think we need to make it a little bit broader because it is a much larger project and has a much larger consequences as well, so. And also I was thinking, I know you were successful with 2 forums with the downtown plaza, considering the nature of project, if we need more citizen input, something to think about.
Wayne?
You mentioned the opportunity for private development of public-private partnerships. Are there some concepts currently, ideas you're already thinking of along that line?
I think I've said before that I've heard ideas from, I think, most of the city council members, and I think every person has a different idea for what they would like to see with the community campus. I could foresee there being an opportunity for a new civic building that maybe is the library on the first 2 stories and maybe City Hall on the 3rd floor. If we were to go with a more compact development, there may be some surplus property that the city owns now that could actually be sold or RFP'd for private development. I don't know where that would take place, and I don't want to assume any conclusions that would come out of this process, but I think, you know, we would like for the consultant to evaluate that.
Just one example from Madison is the Sequoia Commons redevelopment along Midvale, where it was a couple low-slung 80s style commercial buildings plus a strip mall library, and they were able to create quite a nice product there.
There's another one going on Cottage Grove Road, I think.
Right.
Robert, you had some question?
I just wanted to, I had made a note a while ago, but I wanted to echo what Joanna had said, that in looking at the membership makeup of your committee, if you look at the paragraph right above it describing the various kinds of makeup of various members, one of them is the word residence, and I didn't see anything that just said residence, and a couple of people had mentioned the fact that you should probably look at this in a broader perspective. So that, you know, like I was looking Historic Middleton Station Neighborhood Association representative and trying to figure out if that's what you meant by a citizen. And I don't know that that's where you want to go. I would rather see you put a broader statement in there that said citizens and then start looking at citizen participation in the, will help you sell this.
Okay.
David?
I mean, I understand why you drew the black line where you drew it as being the, what do you call it, the city-owned properties. I would like to see a planning area that is somewhat broader than that.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know whether it's Elmwood, city boundary, Terrace, Cuyahoga, somewhere there, that sort of says there is a context to this thing.
Right.
Like the comment about putting a 5-story building next to a historic building, you know, that it's bigger than just those city-owned blocks. It might be that a swap is necessary, or not necessary, would be a good idea, you know, or other things might happen. So I would have perhaps a planning area and a focus area, or something like that.
That's a very, very good idea. I like that idea. We will, yep.
Any other
Yeah,
point
this
from
is the
Plan
downtown.
Commission?
This is essentially the boundaries that we use now for downtown Middleton, the entire map, except we don't typically go, well, no, actually, this is the downtown boundary, except that Parmenter Street north of University up to the roundabout, both sides, is also considered part of the downtown. So maybe we would just expand it slightly to include that as well, or just keep it to this.
I think that is a very good point, and it also would change the whole concept and what we are looking at. I think this is a good point.
Yeah, Abby, I'd like to reinforce Howard's comment on citywide residents. I know there are groups that are interested, especially the concept of meeting places and bringing citizens together that are throughout the city.
Right.
I think that's a really strong selling point, or something that really needs to be considered. Okay, are there any other questions? Then the next item,
Last item.
Mike is going to talk about the history of stormwater maintenance, financial management in Middleton.
Just to give a little context to this before I get into the specifics of the history of stormwater maintenance, we talked about earlier some of the challenges financially for the community, and a lot of those stem from previous to the recession not having exercised some things that other communities had done in terms of additional revenue sources. We didn't have a stormwater utility. We had not maximized our levy to the extent that we could have. We were very prudent. We were fiscally sound. We were pragmatic. However, when we had the trifecta hit us, for those sports fans out there, of the recession, the capital, the debt service on our public safety facilities, and Act 10, Middleton got hit harder than many other communities in Dane County because we had not exercised the full extents of our financial home rule prior to that date. So we were in effect penalized for being pragmatic and fiscally sound, unlike many other communities. And one of the ways in which we were affected, of course, is on stormwater management. And although the city has been a real pioneer, could you make that a little bit bigger print? Thank you. Thank you. Although the city's been a pioneer on stormwater management, we have not done a good job historically with stormwater maintenance financing. I found out from Gary Huth that we have records going back to 1963 when the city became a city, went from village to city, and that's where our records of stormwater management began. 72, 73, we established the Water Resources Management Commission, which has been a real pioneer for the state in this field of management. And several of you have served on that commission at one point. Maureen Giebert and Ken Potter are tremendous experts nationally in the field. In 1979, we created the first erosion control and stormwater control municipal ordinances in the state of Wisconsin. And around that time, the city also approved its first stormwater management plan. In '88, the establishment of developer stormwater fees in lieu of detention for the developer's obligation either to pay the fee or to provide on-site detention. 1999, flooding of Tiedemann Pond motivated the city to find a solution by implementing a pond pumping system, because Tiedemann Pond is one of those kettle ponds that didn't have a natural outlet of any sort, and that's true for all of our kettle ponds. Graber, well, not all of them. I guess Esser does have an outlet, but that we also created.
Strickers, I don't know when maybe that's in here, but Strickers has an outlet to Tiedemann.
To Tiedemann, yeah. And that's always been the case. But anyway, so the solution at that time was a 50-50 split. And I remember, because I was the one that suggested it, we were trying to figure out how to fund that solution to that problem. And I knew that we had really significant balances for both park fees and for stormwater management fees. And I said, why not split the difference between the two, 50-50? And council liked that idea. They adopted it. And that prompted the Water Resources Commission to say, hey, wait a minute. We don't think you should be spending that money on maintenance. And the resolution that you have in your packet shows what the council then approved shortly after putting that resolution or that problem solving in place. a resolution then that would restrict fees in lieu of detention from maintenance over time. In 2000, the city's general fund budget for stormwater maintenance was just over $12,000. And I'm talking about the budget that is in the streets department for taking care of our stormwater infrastructure in the community. That doesn't include the Water Resources Management Commission budget, which now is about $30,000 or $40,000 a year, and that's used for mostly for studies, for monitoring of stormwater flows, but not for actual in-the-field work on taking care of our stormwater infrastructure. In 2000, we had what many call the Hemble Slope. Alan Hemble's property in the creek corridor was sloughing, and he felt that his property, his house, was being threatened by the sloughing in the corridor. He's still there, by the way, and the city put a solution in place, but rather than doing it through Public Works, which is a natural home for any kind of stormwater management, they did it through the Conservancy Lands Commission's capital budget, which I found odd, to say the least. But what I'm pointing out here is that I think historically, because of the success of the Water Resources Management Commission, Public Works hasn't taken, until more recently, a stronger view of stormwater management as part of its domain. And I think that's a problem. In most of the country, it is a major part of what Public Works continues to be part of their domain. But we've been slow to come to that here. And 2000, tax increment financing paid for the purchase and construction of the Confluence Pond area from Lee Bruce Company. In succeeding years, TIF paid for the construction of the redefined North Fork of Pheasant Branch, taking it from a farm drainage ditch, and I'm talking about, 6 feet wide, 4 or 5 feet deep, and making that then into a beautiful, eco-friendly, and wide, shallow drainage way with native plants. And it's truly a success in terms of stormwater management, spreading that out, diffusing it, infiltration, et cetera. I didn't put this in the outline, but Eileen has been the queen of our stormwater success in planning the FEMA floodplain. I mean, this process went on literally for 20 years, and a lot of money from TIF spent to plan that area to meet the 100-year flood guidelines. 2000, we hired Penny Klein, and Penny was an enabler for us not to address stormwater management effectively, because she took on a lot of stormwater projects adjacent to or in public land that through grants and working on collaborations and with not-for-profit groups to find solutions for our public lands and the way that stormwater was affecting them. We also used TIF financing to do so where it was directly related to the goals of the tax increment finance districts. And we have, if you read through those two plans, I'm sure you have, it is filled with all kinds of stormwater management rationale for those TIF districts. In 2006, the council approved resolution 2006-41, which is also in your packet, that modified the previous resolution 99-8, enabling the city to use fees in lieu for maintenance of channels or ponds and relocation of waterways. Those are words directly taken from the ordinance for fees in lieu. However, we have not, again, through, I think, pressure from the Water Resources Management Commission, we have not exercised those in terms, those resources in terms of those items for water resources. We have to some lesser degree at a time, but not to a great extent.
Mike, do we have the money in those funds?
We have about $295,000 currently in the water resources fees in lieu of detention. And that's actually, I think I listed it wrongly in the second to last bullet point. I had 340,000, but Bill provided an up-to-date, it's 295,000, I believe, now. In 2007, Dane County approved a new stormwater management ordinance, which required the city to implement some more demanding policies for development approvals, although in most cases, our ordinance was more progressive than Dane County's, and so we kept those provisions and modified others. 2010, the city's total general fund budget for stormwater management was $6,000. This is right out of our audits. 2011, the Common Council formed the Stormwater Facilities Maintenance Task Force. And I know Susan really pushed this with a passion to get what we called, I think, SWIFMAC was the acronym for that. And Mark, I believe you served on it as well, establishing a non-lapsing fund for 18 for stormwater infrastructure. So I think this is the first time we really effectively started to address the problem. Of course, it's after the recession hit, it's after Act 10 hit, and after the debt service for our public safety buildings had hit. In 2012, SWIFMAC issued its final report, including a recommendation, among several others, to establish a stormwater utility. And of course, by this time, we had to have a referendum to establish a stormwater utility, wherein other committees had not had to have a referendum prior to 2011. Then in 2013, Act 20, and Act 20 I think is the one that actually affected the referendum part, not Act 10. Requiring us to go to referendum in order to avoid a negative levy limit adjustment. And stormwater utilities were, of course, among those categories requiring a referendum. 2014, in compliance with Act 20, the council authorized a referendum to create the stormwater utility. And the Friends of Pheasant Branch endorsed a positive outcome, actually campaigned for it proactively. And it passed in November with over 60% support. If anybody at the federal level actually got 60% for anything, they'd call it a huge landslide. They call it that even at 52%. 2015, the city establishes and implements the stormwater utility with the equivalent residential unit charge of $15 per household, which is far below what other committees have established, very far below. But the council didn't want to have sticker shock for the residents here, and that might have been part of the reason that we had over 60% support. The language, though, of the ordinance enabled the city to use the funds for stormwater maintenance operations as well as capital costs. But the council has the final say on that budget, and several of you who were on the council at the time didn't want to go that far with the expenditures for stormwater, and at least policy-wise have favored it only for construction projects to date, not for operations. But the ordinance does enable it to be used for operations, as well as capital engineering costs as well, engineering and design costs.
Something else to add here. With the utility, nonprofits now have to pay, will be paying for part of stormwater.
Yes.
And
they have been paying.
Have
the
to
city,
pay.
every year we allocate funds
Yes.
to pay for stormwater. We're the largest payer.
Yes, and the majority.
Tax exempt is probably the better term.
Tax exempt.
Tax exempt.
Yes,
right.
tax exempt. And the non-residential amount, the money that comes in from non-residential customers is significantly greater than what residential customers.
Right. Everybody pays the ERU. This is just the amount per single-family
Right.
residential household.
What I want to really stress is
Right.
that it's not just the residential taxpayers that are paying the majority.
Right.
And I think that's incredibly important.
And of course, in 2018, we were all here. We know what happened with the 1,000-year storm event, 12 inches of rain in less than 24 hours. The council quickly, in fact, the very next day, authorized the use of contingency funds, about $600,000 to deal with immediate needs. And then we reported nearly $70 million in damages to FEMA that next month, $33 million to businesses, and residences, $5 million. These are all rounded figures. And the Chamber of Commerce really came through in helping us with the liaison to the business community, as the liaison to the business community. In October of 18, the Stormwater Utility Board recommended to modify its budget to allocate $310,000 towards Pheasant Branch Creek Corridor. So reallocating other funds that were intended for other purposes, for channel restabilization, and $33,500 for an assessment of priority locations, preparation of a 5-year plan, development of a labeling scheme for the sub-reaches of the stream, LiDAR measurements to develop a 3D model of the channel morphology. So although it may seem like things are going slowly in addressing, we've taken some pretty significant measures, another one of which is to, it's coming from Stormwater Utility Board again, to address the Park Street slough just east of Park Street. So that one is in process. We also have an RFP out for what we call Donna Pond, or Chuck Folk calls it his pond, by the police department that was completely blown up through the floods. So those projects are moving ahead as well. I know it's not as fast to the mayor's satisfaction because he'd like the staff to put the bridges back as soon as possible.
Absolutely.
But we're working to try to address the FEMA situation first, and having knowledge of what money we'll get from FEMA before we move ahead and put money towards the entire project. We're not sure that FEMA would actually help us with the bridges and with the trails either. So that may take money directly from our coffers somewhere else. So we're not sure of where that would be yet. Of course, then on January 15th, the council authorized a referendum to be put before the Middleton voters on April 2nd to determine whether an increase from $15 to $45 per ERU could be approved for a 5-year term specific to restoration of the stormwater infrastructure damaged by the flooding. Now, if that were approved, we would have a ready-made revenue source to pay for the city's portion. We're quite certain that FEMA will not provide $7 million of assistance, for public assistance, to repair the creek corridor. We're going to have to come up with some of our own resources, but 87.5% of the total amount that they address can come from FEMA. So let's say they say there's $3 million that's eligible from FEMA, then we'd get 87.5% of that. The other $4.5 million, we'd have to come up with a resource. So either from existing resources, a loan from TIF is a possibility, or to expand the ERU if the voters allow that on April 2nd. Mark, did you have a question?
I did. I just want to make sure we clarify that there are two issues here. There's stream bank restoration, and then there are the recreational restorations, and the two are not the same. They can't be paid. They both cannot be paid from stormwater utility.
Absolutely.
The only thing that can be paid from stormwater is essentially the stream bank restoration.
Correct. And if we get FEMA, if FEMA recognizes the trails and the bridges, that's great. That then provides 87.5% of what we need to restore those. But then there's that other outlying question about how wide the creek corridor should be. Should it be as wide as it is now, thanks to nature? Should the bridge spans be greater, or should the bridges go back where they are? That's a big question that we face. And I know the mayor would like to just have the bridges put back where they are, but, you know, I think we need to do some science on this. We need to know, have a better idea from experts and engineers who can tell us.
Mike, also, one of the critical things on the FEMA reimbursement is, I've been told, FEMA will only provide funds for engineered parts of our
Yes.
stormwater system.
Yes.
I don't know how much of the creek corridor is considered engineered. We
It's
have done some string banks.
Roughly half.
That we've done some work, but we haven't. The
Right.
other important thing that council needs to remember is we need to continue doing the planned maintenance on our facilities that we had planned back in June or July before the storm hit. So even though the referendum passes, at least a third of, well, the $15 that was in place should continue going to that previous maintenance obligations.
Right.
Can I just say one quick thing about the bridges? It's my understanding that, and I might have it wrong, that we can't even begin to put the bridges back until we have the modeling, because we don't know how big they should be in order to protect them in the future. And again, I could have that wrong, but that's what I understand.
No, that's correct.
So, since we start talking about this, we will be discussing on Wednesday at the staff meeting as well. All I'm really saying is this should be a priority. Let's do all what needs to be done, but I'm saying there are people out in the community who would like these bridges back. That's all I'm really saying. Let's do whatever we need to do, whether we put all those 5 bridges back where they belong, or they could be 10 feet this way or that side, and they should be put in a way they are stable, not the way they were put in a tray now. All I'm really saying is there should be priority, and let's do all these studies that need to be done to put them back.
I just want to say, I think it is one of the highest
It is a
priorities that we
priority.
have as a city to do that.
I'm not really sure.
But we
it's
do want to
priority.
do it with an intelligent, thoughtful, scientific approach.
Exactly, that's what I wanted to be done with,
Right.
but they should be priority, that's what I'm really saying.
We also need the financial resources to do that, because what we're pointing out with the creek corridor roughly being 50% engineered, and Susan, you're right, the FEMA's only going to direct its resources to
So-
that.
An example is the Park Street, we have no documentation in terms of plans that was engineered. The engineers that have
But we
gone
do have
out-
some for the toe of the slope, but not a lot.
No, what we have is the engineers have found evidence that there might have been gabions.
Right.
We don't have drawings, what I'm
But we
saying.
did meet with FEMA, and we talked about that, and
So, but
mayor and
that's-
staff.
But that's a place, I would say, that needs to be restored even before the bridges.
And it's going forward. I mean,
Well-
there's a, I was at a meeting, you were at the meeting.
Yes,
at
it's
Water
going
Resources too.
forward.
It's going
That will
forward, so,
take
yes.
all of our stormwater current utility funds to fund that.
So that's just it.
Emily?
We don't have the local resources to address the full estimated, and it could be, that estimate could be high, could be low. We're not certain yet of that because we haven't done all of the work that needs to be done to know for certain. We would like to get FEMA's commitment first because it's done on a reimbursement basis. So we would have to spend the money to get reimbursement from FEMA for agreed-upon public projects.
Emily, you had a question?
I think what I'm hearing is that before we want to move forward, that we make sure that we have that engineering agreed on for that back half, that we don't have the prior engineering for, so that if another 1,000-year flood happens in my kid's lifetime, we would have that, and then FEMA, we could present it to FEMA. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes.
And that's why we're taking a pause for a moment.
Well, and that's the portion that could be funded by an increase in the ERU, through the stormwater referendum. That
Thank you.
would give us that resource over the next 5 years to address the local share of the part that's not engineered and won't be funded by FEMA, and would require us to borrow money from other sources or advance it from TIF to make it available.
And it would also allow us to continue doing the maintenance that we had planned to do on existing facilities. I'm not sure it would be a good idea to put off for 5 or 6 years before we start dredging some of these ponds. And there were projects that,
Right.
to do the study and so on, the stormwater utility took off the table and put on hold.
You know, and for Tiedemann Pond itself, to put in a better solution for pumping water from Tiedemann Pond, for fixing the boardwalks, et cetera. Unless we have FEMA money, we're gonna have to have another resource. Either the stormwater utility or we need to borrow our own funds or advance it from TIF to be paid back. And you already got the overview from Bill on TIF financing, and you know that there has to be, for TIF to be used, there has to be a strong economic development rationale. Like Mark asked the question earlier, what kind of increment would come from that particular investment?
So I have 2 questions. We are getting.
And then I just want to quickly finish, and then I'm happy to take more questions. So if you could correct that dollar amount on your sheet, we currently have $295,000 in stormwater fees in lieu of dedication balance. And in our general fund street budget this year, we have $55,000. And that is no small task. That means that this council has seen it as a priority to increase those funds over the last few years. As I pointed out earlier, it was $6,000 as late as 2010. So in short, you know, we've been a pioneer in stormwater management, but we haven't done a good job yet of finding a sustainable stormwater maintenance financial mechanism. We have supplemented through capital projects. We've supplemented through TIF. We've started to use our stormwater utility for major projects, but we don't have a long-term sustainable source of revenue for maintenance. Yes, sir.
Okay, so the first question is that we are Wisconsin DNR, they have approved all 4 grants, about $500,000. How can we use this money? I don't know, maybe Bill would know the answer. Could we use part of that to pay, if the FEMA pays for that as well, could we use that money to pay our part of the expense for repairing some of those structures? $495,000. So maybe
Yeah,
Bill would know.
I know it was close to 400. Is it
But that-
495?
498, 495, somewhere around there.
Is that money that's already been allocated to the city, or is that money we have to apply for?
No, we did apply for it. Matt Amundsen applied for
Okay.
it. I should have put in the
We've
outline here.
applied for it, but we have competition all over the state for that
It's
chunk
a-
of money.
it's
I
approved.
think they gave us,
No, I think Gary
said they award.
actually have the checks. He
said he
had checks in his drawer.
yeah,
Okay.
well, hopefully not in
Do it
his
in the
drawer.
drawer and not in our bank account.
Yeah.
Hopefully Melissa's, Melissa, did
It's
you
another
get
control we need to work
those
on.
checks? You haven't- We haven't received the money, but we've gotten the acknowledgement that we,
So the second question is for Bill.
but
that-
yeah, I didn't answer that question.
Well, yeah, I would
Bill, I
like
don't
to
know if you
answer.
can answer that question
Drawer
either.
be open.
Do you recall?
You know, I don't know as much as Matt and Sean do about the restrictions on those grants. I was gonna say, I don't know as much of the details of the restrictions on the grants as probably Matt and Sean do. I know in concept from FEMA that we can use other sources to meet our local match for FEMA purposes. So there's a possibility if we have grant dollars from the DNR for an engineered project where we get FEMA assistance that we can use those 2 sources together. I think it's going to be a combination of trying to put together money from a lot of different sources for the recovery. And we'll apply for as much as we can through FEMA. We're trying to work with FEMA on hazard mitigation grants. We'll work with the DNR funds. I still think there's going to be a large local share, and stormwater utility can perhaps be a piece of that. Plus, we also, as you were mentioning, for the FEMA assistance, we'll need to come up with local funds to front items and then apply for reimbursement through these programs.
Percentages, was I wrong? Is it 75% from FEMA, 12.5% from the state, 12.5% from the city?
That's right, yep.
That's correct.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. So if something is deemed eligible from FEMA, FEMA will pay 75%, the state of Wisconsin pays 12.5%, and the local share is 12.5%.
DNR might actually be part of the state's allocation.
Yeah, if
That's-
they're gonna let us use
Yeah,
it, it's likely
No.
they're gonna insist
Right.
as the state chair too.
So, second question is, Bill, how much money do we have in the stormwater utility after all the taxes are paid for 2018? I don't know how much they're already paid or not, that $15 thing which we are getting. That's-
It's already
I
paid.
don't have the exact 2018 ending balance available in front of me. I know that there was the allocation of $310,000 from the stormwater utility that Mike had referred to.
Okay.
And then there was some discussion of unspent money from other projects for 2018. So I can certainly update those numbers and send them out to everyone.
But the collection's
Okay.
already been
Thank
done
you.
because it comes in our quarterly water bills. So
Correct.
It wasn't through property taxes.
Right, yeah, that's
On
not
your
through
water-
taxes, it's through the water bill.
Collected.
And we book the revenue for the fourth quarter utility bills in 2018.
Yeah.
So yeah, that would be part of what we have in the balance in 2018
And
numbers.
you would update that one.
Yeah, we'll be providing year-end balances. I don't have all of that on the top of my head today.
Thank you. Good job, Mike.
Kurt, you had a question?
I was just gonna point out in terms of how state law changes affect what we do, is the Act 243 recently passed, which prohibits municipalities from requiring detention of anything more than 90% of the difference between pre and post development hydrograph. And so,
What is that? Could you explain?
when you take a site, you have the pre-development runoff volume and then the post-development runoff volume. And usually we required detention of 100% of that difference.
Yep.
State law says you can't require more than 90% of that difference.
Yep.
So maybe we can pass an ordinance to tell the other 10% of the rain not to come. But we're gonna have more volume through the stormwater channel. So that's just an argument for maintenance and ongoing capital to get ahead of it.
Because we.
And we're also required to only use the state's rainfall precipitation data from NOAA, which, as we've seen, is, we can call it a 1,000-year event, but we're gonna experience it again in our lifetime, given climate change. So unfortunately, state law doesn't allow us to require a higher volume of rainfall to be modeled.
In essence, what you're saying is going forward, because of Act 43,
243.
we will be lowering our city's stormwater detention standards in terms of what
Unless
has-
we
And,
d-
and
unless-
more, and more of the onus will be on the city for the
Yes.
portion that the developer or the
Yeah.
owner is not.
Unless we
Yes.
use that provision in state law, which allows us to, in essence, declare like a flood emergency and exceed state standards.
So Kurt, what happens for the developers, we already have those agreements in place.
Right, so those, if you had developed under the old standards, they couldn't reduce their, right? They've already gotten development approval,
Okay,
so they have to comply with that old standard.
okay, so it's.
But if you
fine.
redeveloped a parcel, then it's a new stormwater review, it jumps down to that 90%.
It's the newer development.
So Community of Bishops Bay is held to the 100%
Yes.
standard, and they have to meet that.
'Cause that's, yep.
But any new developments beyond, that start effective last year, I believe.
Well, it's any new development that's when they apply for it.
But that's our biggest project in any.
Yeah.
I do want to clarify
follow
one
up
thing
on
I
that
said
question
earlier.
real
I
quick.
said there was a trifecta that hit us, and it really, Act 20 didn't hit us until 2013. That affected us on the having to have a referendum for stormwater utility. Act 10 hit us in terms of city financial budgeting in 2011 and 12.
Thank you, Mike.
I'm
I just
sorry,
have a
Mark.
follow-up on that. So, in terms of the 90% detention, in order to hit our goal of 100%, could the city require a special assessment to build
project-specific stormwater utility structures?
That's a great question, because the 90% detention would refer to,
Developer's portion.
well, it's the part of the dedication and subdivision site review. Whether you then use the special assessment law under the police power to do the other 10% is something I've not.
Probably could.
I don't see any reason why you couldn't, but Larry would have to answer.
Larry'd have to answer that, but that's a great one to pose to Larry, because the statute as it was written was for the developer. The 10% could go towards the residents. However, the residents are already paying an impact fee, and it might be that those two negate each other. So I'm not sure. It'd be a good question for us to ask.
Oh, microphone.
The large developments that we would be seeing in the future will have to get annexed. I think we may have asked him this question, but can't we just preface the annexation with the requirement that they have to meet the grader, or is that illegal under the act?
Or the issue is, if you're providing any TIF assistance,
Right.
can you negotiate a developer's agreement that requires a higher standard?
Well, that's a specific contract.
Yeah, that's a contract.
The state should not be allowed to interfere with our contractual relationship with a developer.
Right.
But they are.
But you can't contract out a fundamental right, so we couldn't.
Well, some of the developers I have talked to, they want to voluntarily even go above 100%.
Right.
So I think we may not have as much of a problem as we think we do.
We should name them out loud.
Yes.
Yeah.
Who are they?
Who are
I'd
they?
like
No,
to
we,
know.
and at Water Resources, and I'm been trying to pull the name out of my head, but there is a development not too very long ago, and we asked them to come back at 100%, because they were at 90, and we asked them to come back at 100%, and they came back, their own volition, at 100%. So, what's that? Yeah, okay, the Red Tail Acres. So they came back
Wasn't
because we asked. So, I mean, there are some developers that will work with us.
And also the person on Gateway, yeah? Or
Goff, Tom Goff?
Golf, yes, yeah.
I think it's good that we give them public credit
Yep.
for doing that, because it's going beyond what the
Stagecoach
state
Trails, too,
legislature
didn't it?
requires. We should thank them for that kind of civic responsibility.
Absolutely.
I just
Go ahead.
want to stir the pot some more.
Well, it's a good time, so.
I think it's good to have this history of stormwater, but the point of contention, I think, was not that we have stormwater or that we need more stormwater utility funds, but there was a conservatism on the council as to restrict the use of these funds for construction. Number one, I think, to maximize the gain or the utility of these funds, so that we could say, okay, you know what, if we collect $100, we're gonna put $100 into construction of stormwater maintenance, whatever that is. And where this kind of went off the rails was including engineering, pre-engineering work. And so what happens is that out of the $100 that we collected, we're spending $10 to $15 up front for engineering, which is taking money away from that construction bucket. And I think that's the issue that we need to resolve. When we said that we would restrict this to construction, in my mind, what that said was that the limiting factor in maintaining our stormwater utility features was the appetite for either water resources or public works or parks or conservancies to do the engineering work, so that there was a shared responsibility in maintaining these facilities. And things have gotten out of whack here, where at this point, the stormwater utility is funding that pre-engineering work. And so that's my greatest concern, is that we've lost that kind of gate from public works, from public lands, from water resources, to really want to do something and to be willing to spend their budget dollars to get that engineering done so that they can hand a construction-ready plan to the water utility, or the stormwater utility, to fund. And that's the biggest concern I have, and that's been my biggest objection to all of this, is that we have to have that gatekeeper that says that this project is so important that you're willing to spend your budget dollars on doing the pre-engineering work. And I haven't heard anything back about that issue. And so that's what I'd like to get resolved, is that everybody has a stake in this game. We've set up a construction facility of funding, but everybody else has to pay their share into getting their projects done.
So Mark, I think you're right that the council has taken a conservative approach to the stormwater utility fund. On the last page of the handout, I underlined the provision of the ordinance that allows operation and maintenance costs, costs of borrowing, planning costs, and other costs related to the operation of the City of Middleton stormwater utility. So the council has taken a conservative approach. However, there's another way of looking at that too, and that is that design engineering is typically part of the capital cost for a project. And if we have to borrow from other resources for that, then there's interest costs related to it that there wouldn't be necessarily from the stormwater utility. And it could also be, it could be an improvement that's for the whole community. It's not specific to conservancy or public lands or even public works.
I'd like to add on that. Yeah, I consider the engineering for a maintenance project part of the maintenance project. What we have not done that is funded by Public Works is street sweeping, and that's a major stormwater maintenance service that the city provides. I don't know how many dollars that breaks down to every year, but it's significant. Because one of the things we have to do is meet the federal standards for sediment and pollutants. And leaves, unfortunately, are a major source of phosphorus.
Yeah, but I think where we are already with this is that would be a negative levy adjustment. If we move street sweeping to the utility, we'd have to have a negative levy adjustment.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that.
But I'm just saying that, so you.
May I finish what I was trying to say? Is one of the things that we, and especially with the Friends of Pheasant Branch, when they did the advertising for this for us, was to say that we would not use the utility funds to do some of these routine maintenance things like street sweeping. We also do not do, like other municipalities, we do not put staff salaries on the utility. So Public Works is still providing all the staff salaries for that. We set up the way we set up the ERU in that each residence pays a set fee, a small fee, instead of doing the GIS mapping that is done on each resident and continually updated in the city of Madison and these other municipalities. That's a huge cost that we have eliminated. So we've been conservative on not doing certain things that could go into the utility, and Public Works is picking it up.
So, Mark, how would you like to solve this? Would you like to have a meeting of the?
I'd like to see some type of maximum amount. So let's play this out. Either you agree that stormwater utility should just be construction and it's off limits, or there's some mix.
When you say construction, do you mean maintenance of
the actual,
not construction of new facilities, but just maintenance of existing facilities?
Correct. Right, so I would draw the line at once the project is designed, right, and it goes out to bid from that point forward. So if there's construction engineering oversight that needs to take place, I'm okay with that. But the pre-project or the construction work, any of that engineering, I think needs to be limited. I'll give you two examples. Last year, the stormwater utility looked at the South Pond for maintenance, and we had engineering contracts that were, I think we had agreed to about $60,000. And after several months, we concluded that we didn't have to do the South Pond. And all told, we spent about $32,000 in engineering work for about a $22,000 construction project. So let that sink in, right? $32,000 in engineering work for a $22,000 recommended construction. The slope on the east side of Park, we budgeted close to $80,000 for design work on that project, and the construction bids are coming in around 3. So again, you've got like 20 to 25% engineering costs that are just eating away at the budget, and it's just ridiculous. If you want to put the policy in place that stormwater's going to pay for some pre-engineering work, then limit it to some dollar amount or some percentage amount, from 8 to 10%, which is what the normal project cost should be. But
have
we
a
are
suggestion.
losing the utility of the utility fund on engineering costs.
I have a suggestion, Mark. The fees in lieu of detention are specific to allowing studies, surveys, and I think when you talk about engineering and design, that would fit within that definition. There could be a bargain made there between water resources and stormwater utility that water resources pays for that out of fees in lieu of detention, as long as it's specific to something that was a developer obligation at some point. I think that water resources probably would be comfortable with that, and certainly the South Pond would be part of that, and the creek corridor could be as well. We've done a lot of money in studies from water resources on morphology and creek corridor, et cetera. So why not have water resources pay for those engineering design costs and SWEB pay for the construction costs?
That's
Mike,
a good point. We need to have that conversation. So,
We need to have
yes.
that conversation, but I have a concern with the amount of projects that we need going forward. There's not enough money in fees in lieu of to fund the engineering on multiple projects. If there's, less than 300,000, when we're paying 20 and 30 and
Right.
40,000.
It could be eaten up pretty quickly.
It will be eaten up very quickly, and if we limit what stormwater utility can do, we're back to where we were and not doing stormwater maintenance that we need to. Therefore, it's got to come out of capital borrowing, and this council has a terrible track record on funding water-related projects.
Maintenance projects. I
Yes.
think we've done really well on capital projects, but we don't have a good
We are
long-term
not
source.
funding those, and we cannot continue to let
And-
that get behind.
If you read any public works magazines, they'll say stormwater is the biggest hidden infrastructure cost that this country has. And it's not just us, it's all over, everywhere. And with climate change, we have a new clarion call to do something about it and address it, because we're not getting help from the federal government, at least not this federal government,
And we
or the
haven't,
state government yet.
we also haven't addressed any new projects that might help minimize future storm events. I mean, we're just simply talking about maintenance of existing facilities.
Yes,
I
Jen.
think we need, I haven't
Point of
finished
order
it.
that this agenda item is actually
Joanna?
just a brief history. This is a discussion that should be done with the proper noticing that we're gonna have a discussion on a new policy.
Yeah.
It's not referenced
That's
as
true.
anything more than a brief history.
Good point. What I was trying to say, though, is we've got to take care of potentially new facilities, too.
Okay, great conversations. Let's keep this going. So I need a motion from the Plan Commission to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
The
Second.
second, Plan Commission adjourn.
A motion from council.
Motion to adjourn.
I second that.
Okay, we're adjourned.